Welcome to this episode of Rattling the Bars. We want to take a minute to look at the situation of a political prisoner that belongs to the indigenous population, Leonard Peltier. We did some stories on him in the past. We just want to update his case in recognition of National Indigenous Day. And so joining me is Professor Ward Churchill to give us an update. Professor, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You know, it's been a year since we talked about Leonard Peltier and his health conditions and his case. Can you just briefly update us, give us an overview first so that the audience can know where we are with that situation?
Well, Leonard remains in Coleman Prison, federal prison in Florida, which is basically a supermax. It's not somehow the supermax level they have in Colorado, but a supermax nonetheless on the level with Marion, for example, which is where they originally sent him, although he was not even qualified, actually, according to their criteria, to be sent there. He went straight from trial to Marion to a supermax. He's still there. They're no longer on lockdown, although there was an extended lockdown not long ago. His health issues remain the same, only a year later. Obviously, they're worse. So he suffers from an aortic aneurysm, for example, which, despite medication, I can tell you from experience, having had that myself, could rupture at any time. It's uncomfortable. But if it ruptures, in all likelihood, he's dead before he can get medical treatment. And medical treatment at Coleman is not what you'd call top flight. He's also badly diabetic, blind in one eye, has prostate issues, has issues with being able to walk, which impairs his mobility, and so on. It's not getting any better, nor will it get better, especially without treatment remaining in Coleman facility. He has requested a transfer to the Federal Correctional Institute, a medium security place in Wisconsin. That would place him in close proximity, or at least much closer proximity, to the federal medical facility, penal medical facility in Rochester, Minnesota. It would place him within not immediate, but nonetheless manageable strike distance for visiting purposes from family. Nobody lives in Florida. He's from North Dakota, but family, he's got people in Wisconsin, he's got people in Minnesota. He's 76 years old, coming on 77, obviously infirm as well as aging. There's no reason that he needs to be in a supermax. He presents no threat to anyone. Arguably, he never did, other than for reasons of self-defense. That's the situation.
Ward, let's take a minute here and step back
Okay.
in time and history. Give me a synopsis of who Leonard Peltier is and why he's being held and how long has this been going on?
Well, it's been going on really since 1976. He was held for a while in Canada as the U.S. attempted to extradite him. The charges on which he was convicted, although he had two co-defendants that were tried separately because he was in Canada and it took a while to extradite him, both Bob Robidoux and Dino Butler, who were the co-defendants, were acquitted at their trial on the basis of having acted in self-defense. And the self-defense was plausible, both because of the comportment of the FBI at their trial, but also because of what the U.S. Civil Rights Commission had determined, and this is their term, not mine, a reign of terror that had been perpetrated on the reservation against members and supporters of the American Indian movement over the preceding 2 years, which had left a number of people dead. There's basically a counterinsurgency campaign that was being waged against the movement at that time. The firefight in which the agents were killed that led to the trials occurred on June 25th, 1975. Excuse me, June 26th. I confused it with the day Custer got his etiquette lesson. So it was one day removed from the anniversary of Custer and the Little Bighorn. It was a place near the town of Oglala on the reservation, a family property belonging to a pair of elders, Jumping Bulls. They had asked for security because they were part of the traditional group on Pine Ridge who were trying to recover land in Black Hills, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty area. This is who was being repressed. So Leonard, who was a member, as were both co-defendants of an entity, subpart of AIM, called the Northwest AIM Group, had agreed to provide security for them. The agents essentially attacked. Now, the context of this was that you had more than 250 essentially SWAT personnel on call in immediate area. So what these two agents that were killed were trying to do was initiate an armed conflict, armed confrontation with the members of AIM that were providing the security. And on that basis, and the immediate goal was to take them out, but also have a pretext to introduce massive armed force onto the reservation to end this conflict, which had been going on, as I said, for 2 years. Now, Leonard was, despite the fact his co-defendants were acquitted for self-defense in this matter, they both acknowledged having fired. In fact, Bob Robidoux essentially said that he hit both agents and those would have been mortal wounds. Leonard was tried separately. None of the proceedings of the Cedar Rapids trial of Butler and Robidoux was ruled admissible as evidence at his trial. So that was completely all eliminated by the judge on his evidentiary ruling, which allowed agents that had testified in one way against Butler and Robidoux, J. Gary Adams, for example, testified to virtually the exact opposite against Leonard. And at the closing of the trial, there's a lot that I could go through that was wrong with that, as courts have acknowledged at this point, quite a bit of it. But at the end of the trial, Lynn Crooks, who was a prosecutor, took the jury through step by step graphically how Leonard had walked up and fired point blank into already wounded agent. And then the second one, who had his hand up and was begging for his life, to remember he had a wife and children, how the prosecutor could possibly have known what the agent was saying just before he shot didn't occur to anyone, apparently. I mean, you're just making it up as he went along. So you had this horrible scenario presented to the jury, and they convicted on that basis. Before the appellate court, years later, that same Lynn Crooks, who had done that performance to obtain conviction in court, conceded that he had no idea who shot the agents, and that Leonard Peltier was never convicted of shooting the agents, but rather of aiding and abetting in the shooting and the killing of the agents. And this confused the court, the appellate court. This hearing, I think, was Judge Haney of the Eighth Circuit, who, in somewhat bewildered condition, asked Crooks, well, aiding and abetting who? Butler and Robidoux, they were acquitted. And Crooks says, I don't know, aiding and abetting himself, for all I know. but aiding and abetting nonetheless. Well, that's a wholly different scenario than they had carried in the press and in court and everything to obtain the conviction of Leonard Peltier.
Okay, let's for a minute jump back forward. Are there any I'm aware that they had a huge campaign to free Leonard Peltier.
Oh, yeah.
Robert Redford and so on. And it got to a point where one of the former presidents was going to give him a pardon. What happened there?
Well, you had, for the first time in history, a mass protest by the FBI. You had agents that came out, supposedly on their off time, with picket signs and picketed the White House. And on the back room, as you may recall, the president in question, which was Bill Clinton, had himself a few legal problems going on with Whitewater and this and that. And essentially, I think what happened.
You mean Monica Lewinsky, right?
Well, there was the Monica Lewinsky thing as well, although that would not be a criminal offense. What the FBI told him back channel, and there's, shall we say, circumstantial evidence to substantiate this. You can either go off and be an ex-president and run your foundation and make a couple $100,000 for a 15-minute speech for the rest of your life, or we can investigate you until the day you die and make your life miserable. So choice is yours. Release Peltier and you're going to get the miserable life. Do the right thing, leave him in prison, and you can play your hand out as a noble ex-president.
Was the case taken in front of Obama, say, for instance?
Obama,
because I know he released some people.
Yes, he did, but not Leonard. And the FBI's pressure on this, let me put it to you this way. Willie Nelson made supportive comments during a concert, raised money for Leonard Peltier's defense and his appeal process. The FBI went literally in Los Angeles from store to store and from radio station to radio station, asking the stores not to sell Willie Nelson albums anymore, and for the radios not to play his music. Same with Chris Christopherson. So they bring in real bare knuckle pressure to bear, pretty crude.
Okay,
and
so
there's no reason to think that's gone away.
So what's the status? Do he have any legal challenges left now?
Not really.
The status of his case?
The FBI is still releasing documents that have been withheld this whole time in dibs and dabs, because there's freedom of information litigation that continues to go on, and they send little chunks of paper that have theoretically been declassified. Why they were ever classified in the first place is an interesting question, and so on. But as things stand, I don't think, nobody thinks to think that there is a basis to take an appeal back to court. They've been exhausted, despite the fact that on the last appeal, it was demonstrated that the key piece of evidence had no, the chain of custody could not be established.
Was that the M15?
There was a shell casing from a AR-15 rifle.
Okay.
That was supposedly discovered by, well, one of two different agents on one of two different days in the trunk of a car that had already been searched. It was the open trunk of one of the agent's cars that was killed. It had already been searched by forensics people, and then conveniently somebody, one or another agent found it, and then they can't account for it until it shows up at the FBI laboratory, and they supposedly do a tool marks match the extractor mark. They couldn't do a ballistics test, they said, because the weapon in question had been badly damaged in an explosion and fire on the Kansas Turnpike. Again, there are so many details to this, you can get lost in them pretty easily. So you had fabricated evidence, possibly. Okay. In any event, evidence that would not sustain admission in a normal case. It was supposedly indicative of the fact that there was only one AR-15 used by AIM people that day. Actually, there were a bunch of shell casings that had been found, but that was not acknowledged at trial. Even Hodge, who was top FBI ballistics guy at the time, testified to the effect that he had personally done the examination, the ballistics examination on this, and made the hookups, and nobody else was involved. And Bill Kunstler, who was handling the appeal at the time, holds up his ballistics report and says, "This is your handwriting, right?" And some notes that are on the margin. And Hodge says, "That's correct." And Kunstler says, "Well, then whose handwriting is this?" And he gets a little flustered and he says, "Well, that would have been my assistant, Twardowski." And he said, "Well, I thought you did this by yourself." I said, "Oh, I had my assistant." So then Kunstler flips the page and points and says, "Okay, your handwriting is counted for, Twardowski's handwriting is counted for, then whose is this?" And that's in front of the trial judge, Benson, on appeal.
Okay,
so everybody goes home. You got clearly the FBI's evidentiary case just fell apart, but also you've got essentially flagrant perjury on the stand from the top FBI ballistics guy. Benson calls everybody back into the courtroom that evening and says, "Agent Hodge has something he'd like to say." I put him on the stand and he said, "I misspoke. I misspoke. The evidence still stands." Well, the evidence didn't stand, and the court acknowledged that. That paraphrase closely how that was written. There is ample evidence of FBI misconduct in this case. To reverse conviction, however, would impute even more. And this we are reluctant to do. And so Peltier remains in prison. So any normal case, this would have been back to trial decades ago.
So what is his support committee doing now? And what do they want the public to do if the public feels like they can support action for the freedom of Leonard Peltier?
Well, there's two things that are happening right now. They're pushing rather hard on the change of institution, Leonard to be transferred to Wisconsin to the medium security facility, receive better medical treatment on site, and also have immediate access to the BOP hospital in Rochester. And it would be great for his morale, among other things, to be able to visit regularly with family, which would be much easier in a medium rather than a supermax, and also geographically close. So that's one thing, but that's essentially the process with the BOP. And there's not a lot that people can do ordinarily. And there's postings on Leonard Peltier has Facebook. The national office maintains a Facebook, sends out newsletters and so forth. The other piece is he's got a federal judge who was appointed by Obama and then resigned over minimum sentencing standards and such as that. He just, they had taken discretion away. He couldn't buy it, so he stood down. He's been working in prisoner support activities ever since. His name is Kevin Sharp. He's in Tennessee. I'm not sure where, but I think in Memphis. In any case, he is in Tennessee, and he is working for a commutation.
Okay.
You got no clear path for appellate purposes to appeal and get the conviction overturned, which is what should happen, but should, and $5 will get you coffee at Starbucks,
Okay, let me ask you this. You might not know the answer to this because it's unclear to me, but the Federal Bureau of Prison Guidelines dictates that a prisoner shouldn't be any more than 500 miles away from his family and from the place in which he uh, uh, was arrested or so on. It seems like if he's in Florida and that happened up in Dakotas,
Right.
that seems like a couple thousand miles. Is there some kind of way that can be challenged?
Well, there's all sorts of little loopholes and discretionary areas and so forth. Um, I don't think Leonard has ever been within 500 miles of location. It would have to be Denver, the federal prison facility there.
Florence, Colorado.
No, there's one in Denver that's a lower security thing. Florence
okay.
was built after Leonard went in.
Okay.
Florence, I suppose, would be an option, but we're not looking to get him transferred from Supermax to an even more Supermax. Okay, and Florence is top of the heap. But I mean, he was sent straight to Marion. He's been in Leavenworth. He's been in Lompoc. He's been in Lewisburg, you know, and now he's in Coleman. Coleman may be the furthest away of all of them. Well, possibly the exception of Lompoc, but none of them have been remotely within the range you're talking about. Those are for normal prisoners, but obviously he's not a normal prisoner. And, you know, for that matter, you could look at Jamil Alameen, A-Trap Brown, who is in Arizona. He lives here. Yeah. I go to within about 20 miles of that facility on a reasonably regular basis because I got family there. And I can testify it's a long drive. That is a long way for family to have to go to make visit and everything else. So that's not a case unique to Leonard, but it is somewhat predictable in case people who are incarcerated for political reasons.
Political prisoners.
Basically, yes.
Okay, well, Ward Churchill, thanks for joining me and giving us this update.
My pleasure, I guess. Maybe pleasure is not the right word given what we're talking about, but I very much appreciate the opportunity to bring people up to date on this.
Okay. All right. And thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.